All right, so I'll get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining the call. We're going to start with some introductions, and I'll start with the. Actually, before we get into that, let me go over the agenda. So yeah, we'll start with some introductions. Then we're going to go over the FAC Leaders Network. So that's the reason we're all here, to help with the development of this FAC Leaders Network. Then we're going to have some presentations when we're going to talk about the tools that are informing the FAC Leader Guidebook, which this process is going to help create. So we have a presentation from Michelle Medley-Daniel, who's with the FAC Learning Network, on the FAC Self-Assessment Tool. And then Kathy Frudholm from the National Fire Protection Association is going to talk about the Firewise program and what the designation process is like. And then I'll be talking about community wildfire protection plans and planning, and and what the skills and tasks that go into that. I'm not sure if everyone heard that, but I did hit record on the webinar so that we can share this with folks that maybe weren't able to attend in person. So with introductions, I think we'll start with the presenters, and then I have a list here of phone numbers of people that are signed in, so I might just go through those from top to bottom, and when I say your number, if you could just introduce yourself. So I'll start. It's Matt Picarella. I'm with the Forest Stewards Guild here in Santa Fe, and this, the Guild is one of the FAC Learning Network hubs nationwide, and so we're working to create fire-adapted communities in New Mexico, and this is a part of those efforts. I'll pass it off to Eitan, who's in our office also, joining on the call.
Hi, everyone. I'm glad you're all here. My name is Eitan Kresolowski. I'm also with the Forest Stewards Guild, and I'm really excited that this statewide network initiative is coming together. Looking forward to the call.
Great. Thanks, Eitan. Esme, do you want to go ahead?
Hi everybody, I'm Esme Cariente, and I'm also with the Forest Stewards Guild, and I'll be working with fire adapted communities on this statewide network as we go forward. Thanks for having me.
Great, thanks Esme. Michelle?
Hi, I'm Michelle Medley-Daniel. I live and work in far northern in a town called Hayfork, and I'm the co-director of the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. I actually work for an organization called the Watershed Research and Training Center, but we, along with the Nature Conservancy, partner to steward the FACnet.
Thanks, Michelle. Kathy, you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Kathy Frudholm. I work for the National Fire Protection Association, and I oversee the National Firewise USA program, and I work out of their Denver office. So thanks for inviting me to participate today.
Great. Thanks, Kathy. All right, Rick, you're up.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rick Merrick. I work with the South Central Mountain RC&D. My title is Forester, and I work in Lincoln and Otero County as the Firewise coordinator for the county commissioners here.
Great, thanks, Rick. All right, next up is area code 231-357-4952. So again, last four of that phone number is 4952. All right, we'll come back to you. Next caller is, last four of the number is 5699. Wonder if folks have... oh, go ahead.
Hey, Matt, I think that's 5699. So was that 264? 264 5699.
Yes.
It's probably me. It's probably me. Hey, it's Teresa Rigby from the Bureau of Land Management, New Mexico State Office, Mitigation Education Program, and so just interested to see what support we can provide, and just glad you guys are doing this.
Great. Thanks, Teresa. Okay, so I think that's your 5699, and then did we get 4952? Is that you, Kathy?
No, that's me, Emily Homan with Chalma Peak Land Alliance.
Great. Thanks for joining, Emily.
Yeah, thank you. Very interested in your efforts here.
Great. All right, next number ends in 1082.
That's me, Chris Nystrom with Wildfire Network here in Edgewood, New Mexico.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Porfirio.
Hi, good morning. This is Porfirio Chavarria with the City of Santa Fe Fire Department. I'm the Wildland Urban Interface Specialist. Hello, everyone.
Thanks for joining, Porfirio. So as everyone was introducing themselves, a important aspect of this whole effort jumped out at me. So this is a statewide effort. So when we wrote this proposal to the New Mexico Association of Counties, that was an important focus, that we wanted people not only from, in and around Santa Fe, but also, southern New Mexico, where Rick's based, and hopefully we'll get some other folks joining in on calls from other parts of the state. But yeah, so this is a statewide effort. Great. Well, I'm going to move along here and start things off. So as I mentioned, so the FAC Leaders Network is part of the statewide FAC network. So this is something that's still in development, and the Leaders Network is going to be under the umbrella of that. So on the next slide, I'll talk a little more in detail about some of these other elements of the statewide FAC network in these membership categories that we're talking about. But it is important to know that the FAC Leaders Network is going to fit into this larger picture of the statewide network. Okay. So this is just some ideas that we've been kicking around the office and with some of our partners. So these are the membership categories that we're talking about including in the statewide network. So the first thing, backing up. So we want to have a place for everybody. So even if you're just finding out about FAC and the network, we want you to be able to bring you into the fold. And if you're just a resident who heard about the FAC network through web searching or something, it's not like you have to be an expert in FAC or wildfire issues to be a FAC member. So anybody can be a FAC member and have access to the forums and resources, which I'll talk about in a minute. So FAC leaders, so this is where we're all working on. The main thing that separates a FAC leader from a member is that they've gone through a process, which I'll outline in the next slide. And these are folks that others can look to for help and guidance if you wanted to make your community more fire adapted. So this is why we want this statewide effort. So instead of the knowledge being concentrated in just a few nonprofits and agency folks, starting to plant those seeds of people in fire adapted communities around the state, that if someone connects with their neighborhood association and there happens to be a FAC leader there, then they can start working at that level instead of always having to seek agency folks or nonprofit folks. And then FAC professionals, so these are people who can't or won't go through the training that I'll talk about in the next slide. But if you're a volunteer fire department chief, Porfirio is an example. I mean, Porfirio has a lot of knowledge that we might not require to go through some of these trainings that your average resident we might ask to go through. And then the FAC Steering Committee, so this is still in development. This is the core group of folks that will help to develop the structure of the network and then roll that out to a larger audience. So this is the task. Let's see, make sure I didn't skip a slide here. Oh, I did. So these are the steps that we're looking at for folks to go through to become a FAC leader. The first thing to note is that none of these requirements are meant to be burdensome. So as we were developing them, we realized we want to have some sort of structure and process, but nothing that's going to be a pain for someone to deal with administratively. So if they are burdensome, then we're not doing something right. We need to reevaluate that. But in general, we want everyone to be speaking the same language, have some of the same base set of knowledge or skills, or at least know where to get them. And again, the point of a FAC leader is, or the role of a FAC leader is someone who we feel comfortable with directing others to help reduce their wildfire risk. So for the first one here, create a profile on fireadaptednm.org. So everyone's going to start out as FAC members, and that would be first step. So we're working through some technological challenges with website stuff, but I think that's a solvable problem for sure. Because in some ways, the network is an online space that someone from Ruidoso can pose a question and someone in Taos can answer. So in order to have that geographic dispersion of knowledge, we need to have an online space for that. So we're working through some options, not only through fireadaptednm.org, but also Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network uses a tool called Podio that we're also looking at as a potential option. So getting into number 2, the FAC Leader application. So this is an administrative tool, so you can't be rejected in your application. It's not like you can pass or fail this. It's just wanting to see where folks are coming from, help us see what skills maybe we're not covering in the guidebook or trainings. So asking about what people want to help their community accomplish, what skills or knowledge the person filling out the application might have. But again, it's not something you can be rejected on the basis of your application. So then the next thing is the FAC Leader training, which is also going to be part of the next couple months work that we're all engaged in. And so even if the leader training is just going through the guidebook in greater detail, I think it's important to have some kind of face-to-face interaction, or if it's a webinar or screen-to-face, for potential FAC leaders so they can ask questions and learn more about the program and what might be expected of them. So for number 4, some kind of action is needed on the FAC leader's part, whether this is a hazard assessment or, as Michelle and I were talking about the other day, asset mapping. So some kind of collaborative action where the potential FAC leader has to work with their neighbors or other community members and start seeing things with their wildfire goggles on, and start looking at their community with that frame of mind. So lastly, making a plan for action. So analysis is only one step, the first step. So we want to make sure that we're pushing people towards some kind of action. So coming up with a plan, whether it's for their home, their neighbors' homes, or their community, I think is an important step. And then they would ideally go over this plan with a current FAC leader. And similarly to the application, I don't think anyone's going to be, or you can't be rejected on your plan. It's just you've taken the step to do that. And then if you've done that, then likely you'd be a FAC leader. Does anyone have any clarifying questions? I've thrown out a lot. We'll have time at the end also to talk about the general purpose of the FAC leader concept, but might be a good time to pause for questions. All right, great. Well, if you have any, be sure to write them down and we can get back to it at the end. All right, so this is what I'm asking this group for help with and what our collaborative efforts will be gearing towards. So creating the FAC Leader Guidebook. So it's going to have a common set of skills that are based on existing tools and resources, 3 of which we're going to go over today. Future webinars and efforts, which might be surveys that I send out. We'll do more to solicit feedback from you all as to what should go in the guidebook, the application, the leader training, for example. I thought this first webinar is a good opportunity to have some conversations instead of just reading flyer summaries and summaries and emails. So we're kind of kicking things off with this call just to get a sense of where we're headed and why we're headed there. So yeah, the other tools that I mentioned, the application, the leader training, those are things that we'll be working towards over the next few months. And then looking to roll out the FAC Leader training, the FAC Leader program in April or May, because the timeline we're looking at. And so here's a little more spelled out timeline for where the process is going tentatively. So by the end of the process, we should have a process in place to roll out the FAC Leader program. So we're here in December in our first webinar, going over the network, talking about some existing tools that will inform the FAC Leader Guidebook. In webinar 2, we should have a draft outline of the FAC Leader Guidebook that can be presented to everybody so that we can get some feedback on it. It'd be really great to roll out the FAC member profile or forum sometime in January or February. And then our interactions in developing the network can inform how that space operates for the FAC leaders in the future. And then I'm thinking also maybe doing an overview of some tools that we've been using here at the Guild that people have expressed interest in and said, wow, it'd be great to do a training on how you guys are using PDF Maps or Google Maps, because that is something that I can imagine FAC leaders using in their neighborhoods to do asset mapping or defensible space zones or things like that. So in March, we'll focus more intently on the FAC leader training and development of what is going to go into that training. The guidebook development will continue because those things are tied together. And then also, we're in the process of working on the statewide network as the umbrella organization of the Leaders Network. But by March, I think we should have some more concrete next steps, potential steering committee meetings, for example. So we'll be working on that then. So in April, maybe rolling out the FAC leader training, which could be web-based as well as in-person leader training. We can talk about in future webinars how we feel about that. Important to note here is that the New Mexico Wild and Urban Interface Summit is April 10th through 12th. And so that's when we can have the in-person FAC leader training. And then also the rollout of the statewide network. Is there a question?
No, that's total. No, it's total.
Public service announcement, if you are in a busy place, you might want to hit mute.
How was it calculated?
All right, we'll just keep rolling here. So I can see a scenario, so this timeline is tentative, where maybe we roll out the FAC Leaders Network at the WUI Summit in April for from a larger audience, and it's officially live in May or June. So I don't want to put unnecessary time constraints on us to get things done by a certain time. I think it could make sense to roll this out at the WUI Summit and get feedback there when it's in a more complete state, and then make any refinements and then roll things out after that, potentially.
Yeah, not that much. It's more like
and again, if people are in a place where there's other folks talking, if you could mute your line, that would be helpful.
Okay, the bags, the luminaria bags are in our driveway. So are the candles.
All right. So okay.
This is Chris
Bags 500.
Maybe I can mute participants.
Enough candles for the 72 plus the 120. Yeah.
Bear with me here, everyone.
I believe so. Mom got them. She got information from Anthony, and he knows like you do. So. Okay.
While I'm doing this, I'm going to go ahead and switch presenters to Michelle, because Michelle, you're up for our first presentation.
Thanks, Matt.
And I'll work on muting participants if I can.
All right, great. Can folks see my screen?
Yep.
Awesome. Thanks. Well, thanks again to Matt and the team in New Mexico for inviting me to share a little bit about the Fire Adapted Communities Self-Assessment Tool today. I want to share a little bit about how to use this tool and some of the methods that different people have used to kind of make it either a shorter or longer process, and then give you a couple of ideas of how to use the information that the tool gives you. So first off, I just want to take a minute to explain why we started to develop this tool, and it really has to do with the fact that Fire Adapted Communities as a concept is kind of this ever-evolving journey, and it's really about developing community resilience. And so that can be kind of a hard process to go through if there's not a clear set of steps that you should take. And so members of the national network decided that we could spend some time working on developing a tool to help walk people through a process that would help them think about all the aspects before, during, and after wildfire, where they might be able to develop community resilience to help withstand that fire better. So we worked with a research team, which includes Bruce Goldstein and Sarah McCaffrey, and also with a wildfire planning specialist that some of you may know, Molly Mowry, to develop this first iteration of the FactSet tool. And again, the purpose of the tool was to help communities assess their fire adaptation practices and their capacity to live safely with fire over time. So how can the FactSet tool help you and your community? We hope that it will help you identify your community's values at risk, identify your capacity to implement FAC actions, assess gaps or limitations in funding or resources to potentially partnerships or workforce or volunteers. It will help you prioritize your future adaptation actions. It can complement your other work plans or CWPPs. And it will hopefully help you increase your understanding of long-term community fire adaptation needs. So there's 4 steps in completing the FactSet. The first step is about information gathering. So during the FactSet process, there's information about your risk that you'll gather, information about past fire history, about response capabilities. There's a wealth of information that gets gathered up, and then the group uses that information to think about their assessment and say, okay, if this is the scenario, if this is what we have going on, what do we think?
Hello?
Hello? Was there a question? Okay, so the second step is to then have folks thinking about that information that's been gathered and making an assessment about what they should do based on that information. After they've gone through that assessment process and sort of evaluated where they stand with each of those practices, they work on prioritization. And so that part of the process is really about thinking about what's possible and deciding what you're going to do next. What's the most important things to work on, what's feasible, what's maybe not feasible. And then there's a final action planning portion of the tool, which helps people identify specifically what they're going to do based on this whole assessment process. We do have a facilitator's guide that goes along with the tool, and this is really helpful. It has tips for each step of the process and outlines some different ways of completing the FactSet. So just a couple of tips to help give you an idea of what each of these stages of the tool looks like. When people are going into this first information gathering stage, some of the most important factors to consider are the scale that you're assessing. So we had some folks use the tool to assess a county-wide scale, and there's a lot of information that you might need to collect at a county-wide scale. We also had folks who were looking at a city or even just a neighborhood scale. So this tool is flexible and can be utilized at all of those scales, but it's very important to kind of identify what the scope is going to be before you get started. There's also a lot of different ways to kind of use the tool to customize it to your own needs. And so you don't have to necessarily complete steps 1 through 4 or complete them in order. And I'll share a little bit about some other approaches to using the tool that people have used. I think the other thing that I'll say about these steps is that in step 4, when you're actually working on your action plan, it's really important to be very specific about the actions and make sort of those SMART objectives, those time-bound and really clear objectives where there's an assigned role and everyone's very clear on understanding what the commitment is. We've seen that definitely helps make it more likely that people will follow through. So, like I said, I want to share a little bit about how some folks have used this tool and implemented it in different ways. we first designed this tool with the team I mentioned, and then some of our national network members went ahead and beta tested it for us. And we didn't give a lot of instructions with the first test because we wanted to see how people would sort of use their imaginations and make this tool work for them. And so 4 different kind of approaches to using this tool came out of that kind of test group. And the first one was doing a multi-stakeholder, multi-meeting approach. And this is sort of the kind of Cadillac version of the FactSet. This is doing the entire process, convening people multiple times to work on all the steps together, and then coming out with an action plan. The folks in Flagstaff used this approach, and they found that it worked really well for them, although it was very kind of time and capacity intensive. They had to set up multiple meetings over the course of several months, and it came out with a very comprehensive look at their sort of fire adaptation capacity, but it did take quite a bit of time to do this. So that's the first method that you can use. The second method our partners in Southern Oregon used, and this one is sort of a rapid assessment. And so what they did is they actually kind of skipped over step 1, which is that gathering information step. They had a lot of different folks in the room who were participating with them, who had that knowledge kind of in their minds, and so they didn't necessarily need to go on a fact-finding mission and hunt down all of that information. Instead, they relied on the wisdom of that group to help them think through what their current situation was, and then they spent most of their time just on thinking about what the priorities would be based on the knowledge that was in that room. So they spent about a half a day to conduct this kind of rapid assessment. Now, I wouldn't recommend that process if you're working with a group that's not very familiar with one another, or if you don't feel like there is enough confident knowledge in the room about all of those sort of foundational facts. It's really important to not just sort of be working on maybe like the myths about your community adaptations. You really want to understand the actual numbers and, the real response times, and it will help definitely ensure that you get better actions if you make sure that you are using good information in your inputs. But I do think that this is a worthy method if you do have a lot of collaborative stakeholders and a history of working together. There's certainly no reason to do extra fact-finding if folks already know that information. The third approach was a leader-driven assessment, and our friends at the Tahoe Fire and Fuels team used this approach. They had actually been doing these report cards from their fire department for several years, and so they kind of married the idea of those report cards with the FactSet framework to kind of provide a report from the fire department's perspective back to the community. And so rather than engaging multiple stakeholders and sort of going through a learning and co-working process together to come up with the same solutions, they provided a snapshot from their perspective of what was happening, and then used that as an outreach tool to begin engaging people in specific actions that they as the fire department were wanting to lead. And then the fourth way to use this tool was actually implemented by our partners in Deschutes County in Oregon, Project Wildfire. And they used the tool. They had undergone several CWPP updates very recently, and so they didn't necessarily need to do that whole fact-finding part or even the prioritization portion of the tool. Instead, they used this tool to help them think about practices that they might have not considered in the past. And so they basically used the categories and kind of the framework of the tool to help them look at their own programmatic work plan and think about if they were really covering all of the facets of fire adaptation that they may want to. And so they crosswalked the tool's main points with their own work plan, and that helped them realize that there were some things like working on business resilience and sort of post-fire issues that hadn't really ever been part of their strategy in the past, but that they decided were a priority for the future for them. So those are 4 different approaches to using kind of the framework that provides self-assessment tool, depending on what you're really hoping to get out of things and who your partners are. So there are a few other, besides having the FactSet like action plan at the end of this process, it can also help in a few other ways, and asked people who tested this for us to let us know about some of the benefits of using this tool. So those included being able to share successes and improvements with funders in their reports and grant applications. So folks were using this tool to create kind of a baseline, and then using it subsequently to show that they had made progress in areas, and then they were able to that with funders and partners. Other folks were able to use this as kind of a launching point to get people excited about working on different parts of fire adaptation. So they kind of created breakout groups, and then got people working on those different activities, and this was their kind of like kickoff to working together. People have also used the information, if they were working on this prior to a CWPP update, to gather some more information that they could add into that and provide that as sort of an addendum or an appendix into a CWPP. And then, like in the example with the Tahoe folks, they use this as an opportunity to encourage engagement and get people working and thinking about kind of the whole system of fire in their community. So the FactSet is kind of an evolving tool. This is something that we designed a few years ago, and as I have mentioned, it's been beta tested by some of our network members, and then since then it's been available for public use, and we've had over 200 communities downloading and utilizing that tool. But we don't expect it to stay static or like exactly how it is right now. We definitely want people's input on how to make it better. If there's tweaks or new tools that could be added that could help people do their jobs, we want to know about that. So the way you can get the FactSet tool is by downloading it from our website, which I'll show you the link to that in a second. And there's also a facilitator's guide on that site as well. And so if you do want to pursue using this tool, you can download it, and then we will welcome your feedback and ideas for improvements. A couple of other notes that we just have sort of frequently asked questions about. We don't track or compare or aggregate the data from the FactSets. So while we do monitor who downloads it, that's simply so that we can check in with people and make sure that they don't have technical issues, or just be able to follow up and see if they have needs. We don't, we're not collecting this at a national level for monitoring. And we, as I said, we always welcome feedback and suggestions for improvement. I'm not sure, Matt, if there's time for questions now or if you want to have those later.
So we do have questions, or time for questions. Quick host note here. So I figured out how to mute participants and then unmute the presenter. And we do have a chat feature. So if while there's a presentation going on but you have a burning question or you don't want to forget it, or some technical issue that comes up, you can type it in the chat window, and then I'll monitor that. And if folks have a question, burning question in the middle, I can unmute that participant. But yes, we do have time for questions. So if anyone has questions for Michelle, we have time for it. I guess I have a question.
Sure.
So you mentioned some partners that have tested the FactSet tool, are there any summaries or documents that have come from those tests that that you could share with us so we could see what the result of doing the FactSet was for those communities?
Yeah, we don't collect people's actual completed FactSets. We wanted people to feel free to be completely honest, and we were worried that if people felt like that information was being collected, that they might be hesitant to use the most realistic lens when they were filling out the tool. And so I can't share completed FactSets with folks, but the facilitator's guide does outline and provide a lot more detail about some of those different approaches to using the tool. So I think that would be the best resource I could point you towards. I'd also be happy to connect you with folks who've used the tool who I know would be happy to talk about their experience using it, and I could also be available to talk with anyone who is thinking about embarking on a process and wants some advice about what approach is right for me and how much time will this really take. The facilitator's guide and the tool itself are both available on our website under the resources tab.
Well, it was
great. Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, I think as I've been looking at these different tools, the FactSet tool, Firewise, CWPPs, the FactSet tool gives a nice holistic picture of things, and it really does a good job of accomplishing what fire adapted communities, in general as a concept is hoping to accomplish. And another quick note, as you were talking, I realized important to note that all these tools that we're talking about, the leader guidebook that we're working on creating isn't replacing any of these tools. We're really just looking at how can we create one reference point for someone to go to that will then point them to some of these tools, depending on where you are in your process. If you need a CWPP, or maybe you don't, maybe your community already has one, and so the CWPP planning part isn't as relevant to you as it might be for someone else. So I think depending on the community, one of these tools or all of these tools might be more relevant to you. So that's kind of the thinking behind having this discussion about these various tools. Any other questions for Michelle?
Improved.
All right. Well, with that, I think I'll pass the presenter baton over to Kathy. Let me see.
Great. Thanks, Matt.
Do this correctly. So I'll switch presenter, and then I'll mute all of the participants.
Michelle Medley Daniel.
Great, so Kathy, is it making you presenter?
I'm going to start sharing right now. I think it is. There we go. We're set.
All right, and I'll mute participants, and then if anyone has questions, you can type them in the chat.
Great. I'm with the Firewise USA program. I'm the national program manager, so I'm very excited to get to have a little bit of time to talk with you about the program. I think some of you on the phone are long-term practitioners and participants in the program, so some of this might be repetitive for you, but hopefully for those of you that aren't as familiar with the program, if you have questions when we're done, please feel free to email me or give me a call. Let's see if I can forward these. There we go. Just a quick snapshot about the national program. It started in 2002 with a dozen pilot sites, and one of those pilot sites was Village of Ruidoso, who continues to be a participant. So we always feel like the states that have a participant in that early pilot really were the pioneers that helped us develop the program, and that first year decide how to form it and shape it and move forward through their successes. So New Mexico really was one of those first pioneer sites that helped us with that. Today there's close to 1,500 active Firewise sites in 42 states. And then we'll jump over to a New Mexico snapshot. So I told you about Rio Doso. Yes.
Sorry, real quick. Can you maybe switch to full screen? Because I think we're still seeing your last slide.
Yeah, let me see. Let's see. Does that show you the New Mexico snapshot now?
I think you might need to, maybe I need to make you the presenter one more time here. I'll switch.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Let's try it one more time.
Sorry about that.
Is that better?
Yes, perfect.
Yay! Okay, so the New Mexico snapshot. 7 new sites were added in 2017 from New Mexico, and currently there's 27 active sites in 10 counties spread throughout the state. And as part of the program, which we'll get into a few slides further back, is the risk reduction investment. That's a requirement every year to stay in good standing in the program. And as we close out 2017, all of the New Mexico sites have submitted their renewals. And this year, that total investment that they did either through sweat equity or through a grant or through projects that the residents did, they contributed a little more than $500,000 in actions within those. This year, only the 20 sites renewed because 7 were brand new this year. But we feel like that's a really strong investment in reducing their risk. At Firewise USA, just to give you a little framework for the national program, it's a program for residents. It helps them organize and collaborate their wildfire risk efforts at the individual parcel level and throughout their neighborhood. It's really about empowering residents to have a role and to take responsibility for reducing their risk. The program, a lot of times when we talk to whether it be a forestry group or a fire department or a conservation district, they'll say, you know, we just don't have the capacity to start another program, to participate in that. Well, Firewise is pretty unique that we want residents to own their own programs. We want them to start off and work with the forestry agency who is part of the Firewise partnership. So the program is funded through the National Fire Protection Association, a cooperative agreement from the U.S. Forest Service, but in partnership with the National Association of State Foresters. And in New Mexico, that partner is Wendy Mason, who works there in Santa Fe as the Wildfire Prevention and Communications Coordinator. So she oversees the program for the state and acts as that state-level point of contact. So residents can direct questions to her and her staff, but we want residents to really oversee their activities, take ownership for the program. Every year they have to renew. That's on them. It doesn't require somebody from local government or an agency to help them other than act as a mentor and a source of information. But it really provides a foundational structure that has those annual renewal requirements, which keeps participants working year after year on reducing their risk. And here's some steps to becoming one of the recognized participating sites. One of the things we always like to clarify is that Firewise is not a certification program. As you know, with certification programs, there's usually some type of ground truthing and vetting of the work that goes into that, and a program the size of ours does not have the capacity to do that. And because of the resident ownership piece, that's just not feasible. So what it is a national recognition program where people are doing a set of criteria to become a participant the first year and then completing that criteria on an annual basis. But by working within that framework with that designated state staff, they have access to tools and resources that helps them reduce their risk within their own neighborhoods. So the first step is completing a community risk assessment. And this is the piece that every state, it might vary a little bit. So we let our state liaison partners decide what's acceptable in their state for a risk assessment. In some states, it has to be done by forestry staff. In other states, they allow fire departments to work on that. And in some states, we have a risk assessment template, and residents themselves can do their own risk assessment. I will say in the majority of the 42 states, the state liaison chooses the CWPP to use the risk assessment as that part of the initial application criteria. Then once they start working on that risk assessment piece, they have to form a Firewise board or a committee in some organized actual homeowners associations that can be their homeowners board. A lot of times it's just residents who have maybe in their former careers were a firefighter or a forester, and now they've retired and they volunteer for their HOA or in their community. So every board and committee is a little bit different too. Some will have elected officials on it, maybe somebody from fire department or forestry, or it might just be residents that sit on that board. But what the board does is they take the risk assessment and they outline the actions that they're going to do on a community-wide level that year. Sometimes they do it for 3 years or 5 years, but they have to form a plan on how they're going to use that risk assessment to move forward as a group of residents to reduce their risks. So they develop that action plan. And maybe the first year in their action plan, it is to ensure that every resident that lives within our boundaries, our self-described boundaries, understands that we have a risk and that there's things that they can do to reduce their risk. Maybe it was a door-to-door campaign, something like that. Or if sometimes they're tied to grants and they'll have money where they can do work on commonly owned areas. But they'll develop that action plan and oversee it, and then as their renewals come in every year, make sure that they have met what they've outlined in their action plan that they've developed. One of the things that they have to do both to become a new site and to renew their standing is they have to do annual outreach and educational activities to residents that live within that site. And the list, we don't provide them with a list of things that we require them to do because we want it to be customized to their needs and fit where they feel like their focus needs to be for that year. But they must complete something that year. They also have to do a minimum annual risk reduction investment, and that's the criteria that gets them renewed or gets them into the program the first time. Up through 2017, that has always been a $2 per capita investment in risk reduction action. Starting in 2018, that's going to change. We've had a lot of issues with different sites on how they counted residents and calculated their per capita investment, and we really wanted to set the bar a little bit higher. So in 2018, their investment is going to be based on however many dwelling units they have within their self-described boundary, and we're requiring a minimum of 1 hour per dwelling unit to be invested in mitigation actions. So as we all know, there's no site that we know of at least that has 100% participation. But that's how we're calculating the figure that we want them to strive to. And the national hourly volunteer rate is $24.14 for this year. So in 2018, they would count up how many dwelling units they have in their site, multiply it by 24.14, and that would be their minimum investment. But I can tell you, just like when I shared what New Mexico had invested in 2017, it almost always exceeds that exponentially on how much they put in there. If they're holding a tipping day, if they're hauling slash, if they're driving their slash to a drop-off area, all of those things count in their risk reduction investment, and they can use that $24.14 an hour to calculate that. We have some sites that annually contribute millions of dollars, and they exceed their required amount by 1,000 times what it needs to be. But that's the minimum investment. Then they have to submit an application through our online portal, and then that application will go to the state liaison, who reviews it to make sure that everything has been met, all of the criteria, and then that liaison will accept it for approval. Once it's been accepted, they become part of the national recognition program, and they'll get street signage for the community that demonstrates that they have retained their active status, they're in good standing, the residents are participating, they have accepted that they have a risk, and they're working hard to reduce that risk. A piece that's different in New Mexico, it's only in 7 states, and New Mexico is one of those, that we have a partnership with USAA Insurance. And effective for New Mexico last year on January 1st, they became one of 7 states where USAA offers a potential homeowners policy discount to their members if they live in a Firewise site. And as we all know in the insurance industry, nothing comes about easily. And in every state, USAA has had to apply to the state insurance commissioner because their actuaries were able to do research. The first state that got this ability to offer the discount was California, and it took 18 months for the insurance commissioner to approve it. That's how regulated and tight the industry is. And the actuaries had to demonstrate that they had gone in and they had researched Firewise sites. And they had said not only for wildfire, but for other natural hazards, that residents in Firewise sites had less loss and less claims on their insurance. Now, USAA is pretty unique. Just a little background. You have to be a retired or active military member, or basically have a family member that you can get that discount through. So typically military members tend to take a little bit more effort. Situational awareness on risk is pretty high, but for them specifically and their policyholders, they could demonstrate that risk was lower in Firewise sites, and that's why they offered the discount. And insurance is always one of those areas that we hear so much about, and people are always asking us questions, what their participation in a Firewise site gets them. USAA is currently the only one that is offering a discount for living in a Firewise site, but I can tell you we are actively working with other major insurers to see if there's a way that they can also be a participant in the program, even if it's not to receive a discount. Maybe it's more to retain your insurance. We have had a lot of individuals call us and say that when they received a cancellation notice or their premium increased because of a wildfire that was close to their area or wildfires in general, that when they've talked to their insurance agent about living in a Firewise site, often that has allowed them to keep their insurance or to not have a hike in their insurance premium. So one of the benefits of Firewise is that piece that is evolving and emerging through the insurance industry. We feel like being a participant in a Firewise site comes with a lot of other benefits. This last year in 2017, we developed a series of wildfire research fact sheets in conjunction with IBHS and Dr. Steve Quarles. And it was a series of just one-sheet fact sheets done in layman language that talked about the actions that people can do at their properties. So this year we featured decks, we featured fencing and roofing, attic and crawl space vents, and coatings, and gave them tips based on Dr. Quarles' research on things that they could do at their individual property. And in 2018, we'll be focusing on windblown embers, and the whole series will be focused on that. If you participate in a Firewise site, we have printed materials that you can order for free. We'll ship them for free to use in your educational and outreach events. We have a lot of other tools and resources that our participants can take advantage of too. So if you're not familiar with the program, please feel free to give me, send me an email or send it to Wendy Mason. Wendy's phone number's on there too, and ask how you can start to be involved in the program. We really feel strongly that the program is only getting stronger year after year, and residents are becoming more involved. When we look at the trends in their annual investments, we can see that they are increasing the amount of work that they do and the participation that they're getting in their outreach events and their education events. So let us know if we can answer any questions.
Great. Thanks very much, Kathy. Yeah, are there any questions for Kathy about Firewise or her presentation? Oh, sorry, let me unmute everybody. All right, go ahead if you have any questions.
Kathy, this is Michelle. I'm curious about the fact sheet pages that you guys made last year, and you mentioned you're going to do another series in 2018. Do you know how many you guys are planning to do next year?
I think that we're aiming at 4 to 5 in 2018 as well.
And will those be mostly about the windblown embers sort of theme?
Correct, absolutely. And one other piece about the research fact sheets, there's a very generic version, and then there's a version that can be customized. So if you are a conservation district or a forestry agency or a fire department, you can add your logo to those fact sheets and print them out on your desktop printer and use them in your outreach activities or put them on your website. But know that you can customize that so that it adds that local endorsement to the research that's on there.
I loved those. Thank you so much for working on making those available to people.
Absolutely. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Kathy. This is Chris Cote in Taos County. I work with a couple CWPPs, and I'm updating, and I'm using the form, the 299-1144. Would this, do you have something that would be more relevant than that for community-wide evaluations?
You know what? Why don't you shoot me an email and let me send you the link to where you can look at what we currently have as an assessment tool that can be used. More than happy to send that link to you.
Great. Thank you.
Yes, Kathy, this is Rick Merrick. Just really wanted to echo Michelle's comments about the fact the research fact sheets are really awesome. One thing I'd like to have, though, as I go do the home ignition zone assessments, I'd like to be able to show just the clip of embers versus radiant heat, just to really kind of show that picture to the landowners as we're walking around their home.
Here's some news for you, Rick. It's not going to be developed in first quarter. It might be as late as June or July in 2018, but one of the new projects that we're working on is actually 3D animation about windblown embers in the home ignition zones. So it will be something where we're still working on the RFP to get that developed. But in that 3D animation, somebody could, let's say, hover over the gutters on a house. They can see how the embers impact debris in the gutter, and then also find out what is the best type of gutter material to use. So we'll do that for gutters, for windows, for decking, for siding, all of those things. But it will definitely focus specifically on the home ignition zone and is being developed to be a tool that shows residents that aren't familiar with the power of embers, how that can impact their survivability and where their vulnerabilities are.
Super. Look forward to it. Thank you.
Great.
Hey, Kathy, this is Matt. If you could share that link with me really quick via email, if you have it available, that you mentioned to Chris, I can post it in the chat window, if that would be all right, and then everyone on the call could access it.
Perfect. As soon as we're done with questions, I'll get the link and put it in there.
Great, thanks. Any other questions for Kathy? I've got a question and a comment first. So I am only a little familiar with Firewise. I haven't been a part of the designation for Firewise at all. And so as I was looking at all these things, also the questions that I get from people when we do community wildfire protection plans or fire adapted communities meetings, public meetings for prescribed fires, sometimes there is confusion about, we have to explain the difference between FAC and Firewise. And so one of the visions of this guidebook is to demystify some of this stuff. And so, we're putting them all into the same guidebook for that reason. So it's not, when someone says, well, where do I go? Is it Firewise? Is it FAC? Do I need a CWPP? Again, just putting all that stuff under one roof so that people are going to have one source for that information. And then maybe go from there as to which tool they use. I have a question, maybe not for Kathy, but for other folks on the line who I know have some experience with Firewise in New Mexico. So what is the policy in New Mexico for Firewise community assessments? who can do one of those assessments? Is this something that potential FAC leaders can do, or does it have to be someone from state forestry? How does someone move forward with that process if they wanted to do a community assessment?
So Matt, I'll jump in. And definitely if somebody's had personal experience with that, I can tell you that contacting Wendy, she's fairly new in her role, and I think that the state of New Mexico has really evolved. Javier Anderson, when he was in that role, he really implemented some good changes in there. And to see what, as of today, what they're looking for the requirement for their risk assessments. I believe in the past for New Mexico, it has been to have a CWPP, and they would accept however that CWPP was developed. But because there's 42 flavors of that, you know, I would like those questions to be directed right to Wendy since she's new in that role.
Great. Yeah, that's the sense I've gotten. I haven't heard of a specific policy, maybe because of staff turnover. So, but yeah, I don't know if there's anyone else has any knowledge of that, or if things have changed, or. But we can also table that. One other thought that I had in terms of the vision of how this all fits together. So, you know, we had the presentation from Michelle on the FactSet tool, which sounded pretty similar to some of the stuff that would go into a community assessment for a Firewise designation. And so, you know, if folks are doing things, whether it's for a CWPP, and they're going through the same processes that they would for Firewise, I think it's important that people know that. So it may not be any extra effort, for example, to do Firewise, maybe not much extra effort if you're already going through this process to do a CWPP, or if you'd started with the FactSet tool and you realize, wow, we've got this assessment here that we could pass off to somebody and say, hey, would this count for Firewise designation? So I think a lot of these tools do work together, and that's another part of the vision for this, is that maybe there's some efficiencies to be gained if people and communities are already doing things for different reasons, but to the same end.
Most definitely. And I think anything that makes it easier for residents encourages their participation and to work together and to have a plan. And if we can make that easier for them in all of our conversations and our outreach, it just benefits everybody.
Right. Great. And any other questions for Kathy? All right. So I will. Yeah. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you.
All right. So I'll work on switching the presenter back to myself. And all right, can you all see that slide, Community Wildfire Protection Plans? Mm-hmm. All right, so I'm going to mute everybody. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat window. And then we'll have time at the end also for questions. All right, so I'm going to talk about community wildfire protection plans and planning processes. And I know there's some folks who are actively working on them in addition to myself. So I'm curious to hear if people have different points of view, different ways of looking at CWPPs and how they're being implemented. We'd definitely be curious to hear their thoughts. So just to start with a little background and context for why CWPPs are important and required for various sources of funding. So this all goes back to 2003 and the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, which directs federal agencies to consider CWPP priorities and prioritizes funding on non-federal lands that are covered by a CWPP. So this is really important. So if you're developing a CWPP and you're adjacent to National Forest System land, for example, if you have Forest Service land adjacent to your community, then it's important to have that context in the back of your mind because Forest Service might, for example, might prioritize fuels treatments next to your community, which for a lot of communities in New Mexico in the west, that's where a lot of the wildfire risk is coming from, might be from adjacent federal lands. And so in New Mexico, prioritized funding goes to projects that have communities at risk that have been identified in a CWPP. So a lot of funding is tied to having a CWPP, so that's important to note. So that's why the communities at risk step to CWPPs is really important. I'll talk about that in a few more slides here. And then there's a link at the bottom here, this slide, to all of the CWPPs roughly in the state. I think there might be some that are missing from here, but that's State Forestry's website where you can read more about CWPPs and their role. So these first couple slides, just going to go through some of the more structural elements or requirements for CWPPs. So these are the minimum requirements in the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. So collaboration, so CWPPs should be cross-boundary and consider adjacent lands. Even if you're just focusing on the risk to your community, I think you should, or you have to involve adjacent land management agencies, fire departments, state forestry, for example. They should provide actionable tasks, including fuels reduction projects. So that's why that's where number 2 here comes from. So identifying treatments on the ground that are priority for reducing fuel loads. Reducing structural ignitability, so this can include defensible space programs. We've got the defensible space zones here from Firewise. This could be having chipper days, doing home hazard assessments, but taking some action to reduce the ignitability of houses beyond just doing fuels treatments. Okay, so warning, this next text has a lot of, or slide has a lot of text. So this is the process and plan requirements for CWPP updates. So thankfully, a lot of places in the state now have CWPPs. So a lot of what we're doing now, at least in the Guild, is updating CWPPs. So a couple things I just want to call attention to here, so I don't have to read all of these bullets here. So updating maps. So updates are not rewrites. So if you have maps from the previous CWPP using that same shapefile data, but maybe there's been new communities built out, for example, so looking at things that have changed that you need to update your maps for. Reflecting changes in risk, so looking at what has changed in your community. These are not, we're not rewriting plans, not necessarily redoing all of the risk assessments for communities, if that's not applicable, but a lot of the factors that would have gone into a community hazard risk rating are likely not to have changed. But I think I'm going to talk about communities at risk in a minute here, because that's a very important part of CWPPs. So highlighting progress made and identifying challenges, I think that helps keep people accountable. So we've worked on CWPPs where there's been good progress made, and highlighting that progress towards maybe there's been fuels treatments that have been accomplished, or maybe there's challenges that have been identified. Is there a reason why Firewise, getting the community designated as Firewise hasn't been successful, and lessons learned that can be put into the plan update? And then, yeah, again, I'll talk about the changes in community risk ratings and high, medium, low in a minute here. Okay. So communities at risk. So yeah, what has changed and what hasn't changed? So a lot of the factors that go into these community hazard risk ratings, they may not have changed. I mean, the roads in and out of the community, if that has changed, that might make the risk lower. If it was a one-way in, one-way out community, maybe that was the limiting factor as to why that would be a high-risk community. So spatial boundaries can be subjective. This is something we've encountered with some CWPPs. So have a method to start with and then refine that method with stakeholders. And so there's a specific example here. This is from the 2013 McKinley County Community Wildfire Protection Plan. So this is the community of Tampico Springs with the circle around it. And so the wildfire risk here, which is a raster layer, so as we look to define the community boundaries, starting with the method of, okay, well, we can draw a boundary around that raster layer, bring that to the community, and they might say, no, the community extends beyond the road on this other side of your raster data there. But having a method to start with and bringing that to the community and then refining those layers as you go is one way to go about it. And then with communities at risk, it's important to note that state forestry has those high, medium, low buckets that you're supposed to put risk in. And so these were developed, I think, in 2015. And so if your plan was developed before then, you might have maybe 5 buckets. And so you have to come up with a strategy for refining that list and putting it into those buckets so that it conforms with other CWPPs throughout the state. All right, so this is a table that we've used to track change in communities. This is from the 2016 Village of Angel Fire CWPP update. So we try to think of what are the things that might have changed that could change the hazard rating. Just to give you an idea of some of the questions to ask core team members, volunteer fire department chiefs, or residents. And so this is an example of where the original CWPP was written in 2009 before the high, medium, low. So we had to come up with a strategy for turning very high to high or high to medium, depending on the community. So yeah, really focusing on what has or has not changed. So again, any additional access roads added or taken away from the community. So that's something that might change the risk. Have the road conditions changed at all? Have there been fuels reduction projects in the community? Not only that, how old are they? Are they older than 10 years, where their effectiveness might be limited? Have there been defensible space treatments, fuel break, open space thinning, for example? And then also, have there been any changes in community involvement? So maybe none of the physical factors of the community have changed, but maybe there's a real push from community members to take action. And so that might impact the community's hazard rating. So this is an example from the Rio Arriba County CWPP update. It was updated just this past year. And so here we've got the community boundaries overlaid on the WUI boundaries. So again, yeah, this is where one of the areas where it was new to me, as you're defining community boundaries, that can be kind of a subjective thing. And so really seeking input from the community as to what those boundaries might be. So, you can start with existing spatial data. So I think in this case, the county had some of these boundaries, but then there might be other factors, other objective factors, the presence of infrastructure, if there's power lines or cell phone towers, for example, that could be included in the community or in the WUI. So whatever you do, I think it's important to have a method and explain it. So if someone's updating your plan, 5 years, 10 years down the line, they want to know how you came up with these boundaries or with your WUI, with your risk ratings. Make sure you're stating that in the plan so it could be repeated down the line. And so it's defensible, whatever you did. Okay, so I was making this presentation, I wanted to talk about collaboration and the process that we go through here. And so I'm just going to, these are my thoughts, curious to hear how other folks think about this. But generally starting with either soliciting ideas from the partners and stakeholders or presenting ideas. So if you're getting ideas from folks to start, that could be through surveys, meetings, things like that. Or also, it might just be you being the starting point and presenting your ideas. So that gets into number 2. So bringing something to the table as a starting point. I think if you just showed up to a meeting and asked everybody what the boundaries of their community should be, that would be kind of messy, not very effective. So starting from something and then working with the stakeholders and the community members to refine that. And just being very clear up front that this is, whatever you present right off the bat is up for discussion and can be changed. Let's see. Yeah, so once you put the ideas out, that's your starting point, and then folks can start to refine that. And then number 3, soliciting feedback from partners and stakeholders. So this is after you've had your draft, you put that out there. but it also is time sensitive, so you don't want to just have an unending process of people sending you feedback, so putting some limits on that. Having some kind of feedback mechanism or several mechanisms. A lot of times this includes a public meeting, but also maybe having a Google form online so that people have multiple ways of providing their feedback. And then lastly, presenting the products and drafts to partners and stakeholders. So this can be separate from the public. For example, if this is a CWPP update, then presenting your draft to the core team. So an important thing that I've noticed here in any collaborative process really is you can't control who shows up or who contributes feedback, but you should give it your best effort and document that effort. And so I hope that doesn't sound cynical, but you know, as long as I've got best capitalized here in my notes, as long as you've given it a really good effort, you've given people multiple opportunities to participate, multiple feedback mechanisms, and you document that, you know, I think that's how it should be thought of in terms of collaboration, because again, you can't control who shows up or who gives you their input. Let's see. All right, moving on. So this is an example of a timeline. This is for the Village of Angel Fire CWPP. So this CWPP we worked on for about 8 months. So one thing I wanted to highlight here is that the first public meeting, you know, was before the first draft. So that was an opportunity for us to get solicit ideas and concerns that people might have about wildfire, so that we could then take that information and put it into the first draft. The first draft should be fairly complete, I think, so that there's not many surprises or any surprises for anyone in the final draft. The feedback from the first draft is taken and put into the final draft. So again, just having this clear process, it's not an unending opportunity for people to submit comments to you, but making that process known, making it clear and transparent, and giving people a lot of opportunities and methods for participating. Also important to note here, having said that about having clear timelines for feedback, I think when you're working with the core team, that's a little different, and they will have a little more leeway in terms of offering changes after the first draft. If you have a core group of, let's say, 5 to 10 people, making last-minute changes, I think, should be expected. So this is a tool that we've used at public meetings to get feedback from residents and looking for concerns that people have that we should include in CWPP updates. You know, what things should we focus on? What don't people know that maybe we realize we should focus on that? So responses to these discussion prompts and a survey that we also put out when we do CWPP updates helps inform what you focus on. So, for example, if people say they're really worried about evacuation, then maybe having a heavier focus on evacuation planning in the final document. So I think it's, as long as you can point to something that somebody identified as a hazard or as a concern, and you take that information and you can point to it in the final draft and say, oh no, yes, we heard that comment, we saw that that was an issue, and here's where we address it in the plan. That's always what I'm looking at when it comes to collaboration and public input, is if someone questioned me about their comment that they submitted at a public meeting or in a survey, being able to point to that in the plan somewhere. All right, so then, yeah, again, documenting the collaborative process is really important for CWPPs, getting them approved, but also it helps keep you honest as, you know, the core team or whoever's working on the plan. So having all of your meetings outlined here, so who attended, how many people attended, where was the meeting, what was the date, and then also including who the folks were that were invited to participate. So again, you can't control who does or doesn't show up, but as long as you can, you know, state honestly that you gave it your best effort. You know, we emailed these folks; they were included on all of the drafts. I think that is something important. That's important to highlight. And also, just an FYI, we did have more stakeholders in the Rio Arriba County CWPP than are shown here. This is just a snapshot or a screenshot from one of those pages. All right, another thing that I like to highlight about CWPPs and updates is making them actionable. So, there's a lot of analysis that you can do for CWPP around WUI and communities at risk, but having actionable priority actions that are implementable and easily read and found in the plan, I think is really important. So I'm a fan of tables in long documents like this. So if you were just scrolling or flipping through the plan or scrolling in a PDF and trying to find, well, what the heck do I do to reduce my wildfire risk, having something like this where it's a table that you can just find quickly and look and have the task and then a little bit of detail about that task, I think is a good idea. So this first one here is something that we've put into a lot of CWPPs, which I think is okay that there's crossover there. So having a group, formalizing your core group or some other group that's going to focus on implementing the CWPP priority actions is an important step. So you've made this plan. Now working to make sure that it doesn't just sit on a shelf, I think is a good step to take. And there are a lot of items that are replicatable across CWPPs, and I think, again, that's okay. So recommending that everybody has a Community Wildfire Preparedness Day, recommending that everybody strives to have Firewise communities. I think it's okay that those things get repeated in various CWPPs. It's also a good idea to include, or you can include big ticket items. So if you need a new fire station or you need a wild and fire engine, it's okay to put those things in there. We've heard from folks, for example, in McKinley County CWPP that we're updating now, recommendations from the previous plan that had things like road improvements. That allowed county staff to be able to show that to their supervisors and say, hey, look, this is in the CWPP. This is why we're focusing on this and why it's important. So including things, even if they're relatively pie in the sky or big ticket items, I think is okay because it gives some justification to folks who need those things to point to it in the plan. Okay, a couple other elements to CWPPs. So planning for post-fire recovery. There's a really good website that State Forestry's put out after wildfire. I forget if it's after wildfire NM or afterwildfire.org. Apologies for that. You can Google that and get the right website. So going over things like erosion control measures, asking questions about things that a community would have to address after a wildfire before it occurs. So how does your community feel about aerial seeding, for example? So asking those questions so you can be proactive instead of reactive. Fire-adapted communities. So Firewise versus fire-adapted communities, explain what that difference is. And in general, I think just getting folks on board with the idea that fire has a role to play in New Mexico forests and maybe including some of that language in the CWPP. Then also looking at wildfire preparedness, so addressing smoke impacts, communication issues during a fire, evacuation, and looking at companion plans. So if there's all hazard mitigation plans where there might be a lot of crossover with things like wildfire, the CWPP doesn't have to rewrite those things, but just make mention to them so people can find it and see that it's been addressed somewhere for your community. So something else we've done, this is for Los Alamos County. We developed a resident summary. So instead of having to go through a 200-page plan, just having, I think this one's like 8 pages maybe, that has the key elements of the plan. What is a CWPP? A summary of the priority actions. So something that anybody could pick up and get the general gist of the update and what the actions are that the county or the village or community are going to take to reduce their risk. All right, well, that's the end of the CWPP talk. So I will unmute participants. And if anybody has any questions, or we can use this discussion guide, or if anyone has any other questions or thoughts about the FAC Leaders Network, the statewide network, yeah, any questions at all.
This is Chris, okay, and we've had a lot of discussion about ratings, community ratings. Mm-hmm. And after treatments, people are concerned that, you know, a high to a moderate, medium rating, you know, we're going to lose all this funding. Mm. And, you know, another aspect of that is, okay, we see that you've done these treatments, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you've improved things. Okay, where do we go from there?
Yeah.
So what are general thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've got a couple thoughts. I don't want to dominate the conversation, so I'll try to be brief. One thing would be to have priorities in addition to hazard ratings. So maybe the priority for that community gets lowered if they've taken some action, but the hazard rating stays the same, so that, you know, in the larger scheme of things with state forestry, there's still a high. Let's see. And then I lost my second thought, so maybe anyone else has thoughts about that.
Hey, this is Teresa. I'm just thinking about it from a, you know, overall management standpoint, and we deal with that on a large scale with landscape treatments on the, you know, federal and public land side.
And one other thing, Chris, that I think you'd agree is important to get folks to understand is that, you know, it's not a one and done type thing. You know, there's maintenance that has to happen. So emphasizing that for folks, and maybe that's the justification you need to not reduce a risk rating, even if there has been a fuels treatment. That doesn't mean that, you know, years down the line, it's the risk is going to be any less. So maybe just getting back to whatever the original methodology that went into determining the risk rating, and then, like I was saying, just focusing on what has changed, what hasn't changed, maybe having a ranking for those things. So maybe you want to put fuels treatments as a lower ranking, which might sound weird, or excuse me, lower weighted, or higher weighted, I guess, depending on what the core team would want. But yeah, I guess the concern of losing funding because of doing treatments, yeah, I think we should definitely work to avoid that, because we don't want to de-incentivize action.
Yeah, it's like, okay, you received hundreds of thousands of dollars and treated, you know, several thousand acres, and your rating is still at this, you know, which really there's 3 ratings, right? High, moderate, or low, and then inserted in there is very high. But what I want to see is a quantifiable measurement like that NFPA form, mm-hmm. that maybe can show a graphic scale of up and down, you know, through treatments and retreatments, you know, fire hardened homes and you know, show that we're receiving this money and we're doing it justice.
Yeah, and hey, if I could add, I tried to add earlier and I cut myself off. I hit my mute button on accident. But I think you're right on. It's a really good question, and I think you know, looking at that fuels treatment effectiveness is kind of where a lot of the energy has gone, because you're right. I mean, we go out and we treat, you know, big areas, put a lot of money into it, and it changes it. But does it really keep? Would it really? The question is, does it make it so that that treatment does what it was intended to do, which is, you know, whether it's to reduce intensities of the fire or, you know, allow for easier control of the fire, those kinds of things. And starting to track that kind of stuff can be helpful. So if you know that you had some kids playing with matches or, you know, whatever your fire cause was, but the department was able to catch it because of your fuels treatment, those kind of successes start to show That's what we've been trying to capture on a federal level with the fields treatments that are being done on a landscape level, and I don't see it any different in this case, where we're talking communities, because you don't want to lose the funding, and you know that it is a maintenance thing, as was mentioned. So, looking at these other ways to still show that there's a need to continue that work, I think is important, like you're saying. So maybe thinking about it from an effectiveness standpoint and showing where those changes have been made, and it's a good thing, and you don't want to lose that. It's just one way to look at it. But we are tracking, numbers of fires that hit fuel treatments and that type of thing. So, and what the effect has been. So.
Yeah, there's been some amazing ones in Arizona.
Yeah. But I think for communities could do the same kind of a thing, start to track where you've had those successes and show that you need a continued investment there.
Yeah.
This is Rick. So Ruidoso, with its ordinance that required landowners within the village of Ruidoso to thin their lots, they're about 95% done on that project. They have received a lot of funding over the years to get this cost share program, to get this treatment done. And of course, as we go into the update, Chris, just to echo what you said, definitely that conversation is going on here. So definitely it's been going on long enough where maintenance is coming around, but generally on these cost share programs, a second entry is not part of that funding. But I would just venture to say that if we had a fire in Ruidoso, would we lose homes? Based on the home ignition zone, I think that's a big possibility. And then just as we look at the fires in California, we can see that vegetation is not necessarily what is burning our homes down. So I wonder on the CWPPs, and this is where I'm trying to get to, if that risk analysis, when we say high, are we looking at it from a vegetation treatment? Are we looking at it from structures, what they're built out of, closeness of structures? I just wonder as we do the risk assessments if there's another way to keep those in that high category other than the vegetation treatment.
I think that's a great point, Rick. That'd be interesting to do a study of other CWPPs and see what sort of methods went into those risk assessments. What I found just from looking at some of them is that, a lot of it has not been related just to vegetation, or that's just been a piece of it, but like roads, any number of factors that don't change as opposed to vegetation, which can change. Something that we should look at. And I think just being clear about that in the CWPPs is helpful for everybody, because then as people are writing CWPPs, they can see what other folks have done to characterize that risk.
Yeah, the hard thing about a CWPP is that you got to do an overall assessment. So you kind of get a big view of metal roofs, gable end vents, attachments to homes and adjacency and all that, and try to get this general big scoop of community. But
So I'm noticing we're 5 minutes after 3:30. I think I may have gone on too long for my presentation, so I'm okay to stay on talking for another few more minutes if people have questions, but I would understand if folks had to cut out, because I think the original plan is for 2 to 3:30. Just wanted to call attention to that. So if anyone has questions, happy to keep the line open. But it is 3:36 now. Any other questions broadly about the FAC Leaders Network or any of the presentations? All right. Well, I guess if no one has anything else, we can end the call. Thank you again, everybody, for coming. Really happy to have a lot of participation, to see all the names in the attendee list. So I will work on getting the presentations out to everybody from the presenters, and then also the recording I could share with participants as well, or make that available. So if anyone has any follow-up questions, feel free to shoot me an email, and I can get those to the presenters, or any other thoughts about the FAC Leaders Network. Also feel free to shoot me an email about that. And then moving forward, I'll be in touch with opportunities for feedback about everything we've talked about. There might be a survey involved, heads up. But yeah, we'll work on setting the date for the next webinar. So this is 1 of 4. And I hope everybody will continue to stay engaged and excited about moving forward and developing our FAC Leaders Guidebook and Network, and talking with you all again.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.